everyone. I'm Kara Griffith, the President and CEO of Tax Analysts. Thank you for joining us today to discuss the future of the global tax deal, and in particular, the OECD's Pillar 2 in the aftermath of America's withdrawal. Today's event is the latest installment of Taxing Issues, our series of public discussions on tax issues. We launched this series to encourage debate on the leading tax issues of our time, and we surely will have a lot to debate this year. We'll continue to bring the tax community together with leading policymakers and experts for bipartisan discussions on the future of tax policy and administration. As always, we welcome your feedback on how we can make our webinars more useful, as well as your suggestions on future webinar topics. You can send your feedback and suggestions to events@taxanalyst.org. We will also welcome your questions for today's event. Please use the chat feature to submit questions during the webinar. I'll begin by asking the panelists a few questions before turning to questions from you, and I promise to get to as many of them as time permits. For those of you who would like CPE credit today, please be sure to participate in the program for at least 50 minutes and answer at least 3 of the poll questions that will appear throughout the webinar. They will appear on the right side of the viewing window above the comment section. To receive credit for your answers, you need to register with Pigeonhole, our interactive Q&A system, by providing your name and email. Also, please remain in the default viewing window because you won't be able to see the questions if you expand the program to full screen. The course materials, which we sent out in advance, are also available for downloading under the viewing window. Now, way back in 2021, as most of you will remember, 139 countries, including the United States, signed on to the OECD's two-pillar project that was designed to counter the efforts of multinationals to shift profits into low or no tax jurisdictions, which erodes the global tax base. Now, by way of background, Pillar 1 allocates the profits of multinationals among the jurisdictions where they have what's called substantial engagement. In other words, where they sell goods and supply services. Pillar 2 imposes a minimum effective tax rate of 15% on companies with over 750 million euros in every country in which they operate, regardless of local tax rates. Pillar 2 consists of a set of global anti-base erosion, or GLOBE rules, with 2 key mechanisms that apply when the effective tax rate in a local jurisdiction is lower than 15%. One is the Income Inclusion Rule, or IIR. Under it, a multinational pays a top-up tax in the jurisdiction of the ultimate parent entity or intermediate parent entity. The second is the Undertaxed Payments Rule, or UTPR. If the IIR does not collect all the top-up tax in a certain jurisdiction, the UTPR assigns that liability to the multinational's other entities in other jurisdictions around the world. Now, 2025 was supposed to be the year when Pillar 2 would be more fully implemented. To date, around 65 countries have implemented or declared their intention to implement all or part of Pillar 2. Many European nations implemented Pillar 2 last year, and a second wave of countries, including several Asia-Pacific countries, will do so this year. So there's a lot going on in the world. But on his first day in office, January 20, President Trump signed an executive order that withdrew the United States from the global tax deal, stating that, and I'm quoting, "It allows extraterritorial jurisdiction over American income," end quote. He directed the Treasury Secretary to investigate whether any foreign countries have put in place or will likely put in place any tax rules that are extraterritorial or disproportionately affect American companies, and to develop options for the United States to protect itself against such rules. Now, the executive order was no great surprise. Trump was not expected to support Pillar 2, but it raises lots of questions about how the U.S. withdrawal will affect the future of the 2 pillars and how it will affect the U.S. income of both individuals and corporations. In his executive order, the president invoked Section 891, an old, relatively unknown and unused section of the tax code, which would allow the United States to double the tax rate on residents of countries that impose discriminatory taxes on Americans. It's an extreme measure that certainly attracted the attention of countries around the world. And shortly thereafter, the House Ways and Means Committee Chairman Jason Smith introduced, and the committee's Republicans co-sponsored, the Defending American Jobs and Investment Act, which is a more measured form of retaliatory treatment for countries that impose discriminatory taxes on U.S. companies. It highlights the UTPR and digital service taxes, or DSTs, as examples of discriminatory taxes. For each of 4 years, the bill would add 5% to the tax rate on the U.S. income of individuals and companies of a foreign jurisdiction that imposes a discriminatory tax. That would leave those tax rates 20% higher after 4 years, and they would stay there while the discriminatory foreign tax remained in effect. Although the bill wouldn't double the tax rate of foreign taxpayers like the president's executive order would, it would still have a significant impact on them. So in some ways, we're back to the drawing board. Without U.S. support, Pillar 2's future is clearly uncertain. Can Pillar 2 function effectively without U.S. participation? Are there possible compromises between the OECD and the United States? And how will companies be affected in a fragmented system? Now, we have an excellent panel today to discuss and debate these and many other questions. First, we have Pat Brown. He's a partner and co-leader of PwC's Washington National Tax Services practice. Next, we have Joachim English. He's chair for tax and public law at Munster University and an advisor to the OECD and European Commission. And we have Mindy Hertzfeld, a professor at the University of Florida Levin College of Law and counsel for the Potomac Law Group. And we have Scott Levine, former Treasury Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Affairs. I want to thank you all for being with us today, and I'm very excited about this conversation. So Scott, let me turn to you first. During your time at Treasury, you were intimately involved in some of the negotiations on Pillar 2. From your standpoint, can Pillar 2 and the global minimum tax be maintained in its current form without U.S. support? What happens if the rest of the world enacts Pillar 2 and the U.S. and maybe China and India are sitting on the sidelines?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kara. Well, first, I think it's important to understand that it depends on what you mean by without U.S. support, and also, and I'll get to in a moment, what it means to sit out of a negotiation as opposed to maybe be listening on the sidelines. If we look at Pillar 2 in a vacuum where the U.S. doesn't retaliate with tariffs and, like, say, Section 891 and proposed Section 899 that you just mentioned, among other measures, aren't in the environment, then I think Pillar 2 could definitely survive. Although I think what I just said is unrealistic. We're not going to have that circumstance because we already know that we're not in a world without any of those measures. So I guess the question is, what must be done to the Pillar 2 rules vis-a-vis the U.S. tax system for the current administration to be sufficiently content to not retaliate, or at least not with respect to Pillar 2? So I'd say that based on recent public statements and other conversations, it seems that the Treasury Department plans to stay at the Pillar 2 table and continue to negotiate. I take this as very welcome news. Last Friday, a Treasury official stated that some sort of coexistence of the Pillar 2 and U.S. tax systems represent, I have a quote here, a viable path to preserve gains within the two global minimum tax systems. And this official went on to say that allowing the two systems to live in relative harmony would have the benefit of preserving tax sovereignty, limiting disputes, and allowing for negotiations and discussions to continue in a multilateral forum, which I took to, of course, be a reference to the OECD. So one word in that I think stuck out to me, in addition to the fact that there are negotiations actually going on as we speak, is the word that we hear a lot from Republicans in Congress, the current administration, as well as many of their supporters, is the word sovereignty. I personally think the term isn't particularly helpful. Every country, of course, wishes to preserve their sovereignty, and countries can always back out of bilateral or multilateral agreements when they see fit. They can also decide to renegotiate, as we've seen in the trade area since the new administration took shape. But if it's done too often or too radically, then those countries, may ultimately lose credibility. So I think all this is a long-winded way of me just saying that there will need to be concessions by all the parties to the negotiations in order to find a way for the globe rules and the U.S. tax system to live in relative harmony with each other. I know that we're going to get in a little later about possible landing zones, so I'll stop there.
Excellent. So it is, as we talked earlier, it's a decided maybe. Mindy, let me turn to you and ask the same question. I'm going to ultimately ask of each of the panelists just to get a baseline on your thoughts on whether Pillar 2 can be maintained in its current form without a U.S. participant.
Yeah, so I guess I start with questioning the question, what advantages are there of retaining Pillar 2 in its current form? And I think Pillar 2 was always an accident of the efforts to find a solution for taxing the digital economy. And I think we've ended without US and Chinese full participation. I think we've ended up with primarily a European tax. There are very few, if any, Latin American countries and certainly no African countries have opted in. And so is this what's called a global minimum tax really an end run around constraints that the EU has imposed upon itself with its treaty that would otherwise prevent a rigorous CFC regime? I'll let Joachim answer that. I'm not. He's far more qualified than me. But so what are we trying to accomplish here with this global minimum tax? And obviously, it's a little late in this process to start over, but perhaps we should be thinking about it as a European minimum tax, which is fine, but then why does that need US support, and what are we trying to accomplish there? I'd also pick up on Scott's point on sovereignty. I think that there's two aspects of the sovereignty. One is just what are the rules today, and perhaps some compromise can be reached that would allow the members of the inclusive framework to bless the U.S. system and say we accept that as consistent with the Pillar 2 rules. But the second part is interpretation of the OECD model rules going forward. And I think there's serious risks of sovereignty there going forward, even if the US system is blessed, because interpretation of those rules is an OECD function and has little political oversight from any of the democratically elected governments that are members of the inclusive framework. And so I view that as inherently problematic for the Pillar 2 regime going forward. And I'm not sure how resolving coexistence today addresses that part of the challenges that Pillar 2 poses for the US.
Joachim, I'm interested in your your sort of answer to the question, but also some response to what Mindy just said. And it has Pillar 2 turned into really a European initiative that will lack the involvement of the rest of the world?
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, when it comes to the question whether it can survive with that US support, I think Scott has really pointed out neatly that in principle, Pillar 2 has been designed to work even without the support of major jurisdictions, as long as we have a critical mass of countries implementing it, because that's the logic. It's two collection mechanisms, the IIR and the UTPR have, that you pointed out. When enough countries participate, where most multinationals would either have a headquarters or an intermediate holding, or at least some subsidiary that is called by the UTPR, the minimum tax will be levied. And then if other countries don't participate, even if it's the US, that doesn't undermine the way the system's supposed to work. But the problem, of course, is that the US is not just sitting by the sidelines, it's actively opposing. Now, when it comes to the question whether it's just merely a European project, I would say at its core, it has been a project that Europeans fought for more than others, probably. And of course, because we have the EU Pillar 2 directive, 22 EU member states have enacted the international effective minimum tax and actually have to do so to comply with European law. However, that's just half of the 43 countries globally that have implemented the international effective minimum tax, or some form of IIR, UTPR, or both, and an additional 12 countries that have a QDMTT. So it's not merely a European project anymore. I'd say it's mostly an OECD member project, except, of course, the US and some other countries, mostly in Southeast Asia or Australasia. So it's more than just European. The Europeans form the bulwark because we have the directive. So for the Europeans to abandon the project is much more difficult than, say, for Japan or Australia, because every country of the 27 member countries would have to agree to go back to a pre-Pillar 2 status, and that is not foreseeable currently. Germany, the government that is about to be formed, has already declared that they will stick to Pillar 2. Other major jurisdictions in Europe are not inclined to go back from Pillar 2 in the short term. So I think Europe has a special role because it will, in a way, guarantee that Pillar 2 is not going to disappear in the next few years. But it's not just merely a European project. And last comment, given the fact that the US is actively opposing Pillar 2, is threatening retaliatory measures, there is obviously a need and a willingness to compromise from the side of the OECD, but also from the side of the European Commission and major EU member states. And from what I've heard, there is negotiations with the OECD, with EU member states, and with the EU Commission. And that will not leave Pillar 2 the way we have it now, I think, because if the US will get some concessions, and we're going to discuss this later, then it will be difficult, in my view, to withhold them from other countries. And that means you will have to somehow change the Pillar 2 architecture to some extent.
Excellent, thank you. Pat, I came to you last in part because I wanted you to be able to respond to everyone, but also to kind of give the sense of the business community on what they're feeling, and is the uncertainty with the US now withdrawing from Pillar 2, is that impacting how multinationals are perceiving the project as a whole, and then just what are they feeling in general?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I mean, let me start by obviously addressing the question you addressed to everyone. But I think I don't have a whole lot to add to what everyone else has said, which, I mean, the way I would sort of summarize it is Pillar 2 cannot move forward without, at a bare minimum, kind of US acquiescence to whatever reformulation the project takes. I agree with Draken that as long as the US stands in active opposition, there is not a path forward for Pillar 2. And I think that's widely recognized, which is why there are discussions going on right now. I think in terms of, the discussion earlier that Mindy and Scott were having with respect to sovereignty, I sort of look at this, I mean, maybe it's sort of closer to where Mindy, the views that Mindy expressed, but the way I would think about this is the current situation that we find ourselves in with Pillar 2, I don't think it was just foreseeable. I think it was inevitable. And the reason I think it was inevitable is because the United States Congress was never going to, over the long term, it was always just a matter of time before Congress recognized that this project was a threat to its Article 1 obligations and rights to make tax policy for the United States. And as soon as Congress became aware of that, we started, because Congress was informed by the business community, we started hearing that there were concerns. And of course, initially we heard concerns about tax equity investments. And then we heard concerns about the Inflation Reduction Act credits. And then those concerns morphed into concerns about, well, what about the research credit, the R&D tax credit in the United States? But the reality is those concerns were never about those specific incentives. They were always about the question of who makes tax policy for the United States? And is that the Congress, or is it somebody outside the United States that is permitted to put constraints on the United States' ability to make tax policy for the United States? And that was never going to be acceptable to the Congress. So to pick up on Mindy's point, if we fast forward from where we are today, maybe not even very far into the future, by the way, we may very well have a tax bill this year that has, for example, additional incentives in it. Perhaps additional incentives for domestic manufacturing, perhaps some sort of expanded FDII, right? All of these things will, if they do come to pass, represent the will of Congress. That Congress believes very much it has the obligation to discharge making tax policy for the United States. So the conflict that we see right now, I'll call it a crisis because I think Pillar 2 is in a crisis right now. The crisis that we see right now really always has been inevitable. It was always just a question of time. Now, It's not an expression that I love, but Rahm Emanuel has often used the term or the expression, never waste a crisis. And again, picking up on Mindy's point, I would hope that what happens right now with respect to Pillar 2, maybe Joachim, you were kind of getting at this as well, is not simply something that says we're going to create a situation that protects the current US guilty regime, the current US domestic tax system, and creates this coexistence and stops right there. And then we'll act like nothing has changed, and we can just keep moving forward with Pillar 2 exactly as it is. To me, that would be wasting the crisis. It seems to me what we should be looking at right now is what kinds of fundamental questions need to be asked about how the Pillar 2 rules coexist with national sovereignty, not just US national sovereignty, but sovereignty of other countries as well. And I don't think that question has ever, well, I know that question has never been answered. It seems to me a question that needs to be addressed in the current moment. Otherwise, we're wasting this crisis. We're simply acting as though we can address something at a point in time and move on from it. And that point in time is the US is making noises with respect to the guilty regime, with respect to the UTPR on US income. Well, let's fix that narrow point and pretend that nothing else has happened. I think that would be a mistake. I think that would be wasting the crisis. So then, Kara, maybe to finish off, you asked about, the reaction of companies. And I do think, what we're seeing right now, and this is not sort of, you don't have to peer behind the curtain to see this. This is all playing out in public. You're seeing, a number of US companies making the point that Pillar 2 does need to be changed to accommodate the US guilty regime, to ensure that the UTPR doesn't apply to the US income of US companies. Those are two separate changes, of course, that would need to be made. But, Kara, to your point, one of the things you're also seeing is a reaction from non-US multinationals, non-US headquartered multinationals. And their reaction is some version of, and this goes directly to something that Joachim, you mentioned, their reaction is very much along the lines of, well, hang on a minute. Is what we're talking about here a change that is only going to affect the US guilty regime and the UTPR as applied to the US income of US companies? Because that's going to leave us in a very awkward and uncomfortable situation and not something that we want to see. So I think with respect to US companies, to be sure, there's a lot of question around details, but there's an awful lot of support as well for the Treasury Department to go in and say, we need to make sure that the US tax system can coexist, if that's the term to be used, alongside whatever Pillar 2, a reformulated version of Pillar 2. For non-US multinationals, the question is, well, what exactly are we talking about here? Are we talking about something that's an accommodation to only the United States concerns? Because that's going to leave us in an awkward position, and we are uncomfortable with that. And that conversation, I feel like, is not really happening a great deal in public, but is very much happening behind the scenes, and is to a certain extent spilling out in public as well.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to jump ahead slightly because I think that, Pat, you mentioned not wasting a crisis, which really gets to the core of what I think the conversation that we wanted to have and that I think is necessary to have. So, Scott, I'm going to come back to you. What changes do you foresee need to happen with Pillar 2 to bring the United States back to the negotiating table? You mentioned the meeting in Cape Town where the United States is expressing interest in staying at the Pillar 2 negotiating table. What do you think it's going to take to actually move this forward and get a good conversation going about something that would bring the United States back to the table?
Yeah, well, thanks, Garrett. First, let me just quickly address one of the things that Pat just finished there. And I think that Mindy and Joachim also said on the sovereignty point, then maybe put it to bed, is just that the system, anytime you whether it's a tax treaty or anything else that either is Congress passes or is ratified by the Senate, is a moment in time, and it puts sort of some things in ice or in place until some later date when someone else doesn't like it and decides to change it. So the fact that this would be inevitably a problem because the U.S. would come up, the Congress would one day have an incentive they wanted to enact and it wasn't consistent with the model rules or with administrative guidance. I think everybody intended this or assumed that this would be something that's a living, breathing system that would continually need to be updated and looked to. To answer your question though about like where we might be going or what's a landing spot, again, based on these public statements and reactions from other IF members, it seems that the current administration at least believes that the US tax system should operate, as we discussed, like a parallel system, as opposed to amending certain US tax laws to be Pillar 2 compliant. I do think that Pat is right that it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to get at least this Congress and this president to amend US tax law to make Pillar 2 more amenable. Of course, that's, there's always the possibility that at the last minute during the reconciliation process that Congress could be looking for some loose change under the seat cushions and realize that, country by country or some other piece of the pie that was supposed to be international tax legislation under the Biden administration could end up finding its way at least partially into the system, but probably not likely. Then I think under this so-called parallel system, we presumably would have both the UTPR and the IR would need to be turned off with respect to US UPEs, or the parent companies of these US multinationals, and their US and foreign subsidiaries. And the current temporary safe harbor only applies to the UPEs, so that would have to be expanded. I think the system would also need to address the concern that was mentioned a little earlier about, how to stop other countries from repealing their IIRs and UTPRs. So one thing we didn't have a chance to discuss is what are there's every action, there's another reaction by other jurisdictions. And so if the US, as Pat and Jakob mentioned, would get what could be viewed as favorable treatment, then other countries and their taxpayers are going to say the same thing, like, what about us? It also, could lead to like a kind of a death spiral of the system if certain jurisdictions decide that they don't need to have Pillar 2 legislation anymore. Further, I think raises legitimacy concerns if the UTPR, for example, only applies to small countries or the EU, but is turned off for countries like the US and China. And I think it would have to, also be modified, the current safe harbor, because right now it's focused on the statutory rate. And as we all know, the statutory rate and the effective rate are quite different. And for example, I think my recollection is that Switzerland, on the latest OECD corporate tax statistics database, shows a statutory rate close to 20%. And I think most would agree on this panel that that's not the typical effective tax rate of multinationals that operate in Switzerland. The other things I would just say is that I don't see the CAMT working as a QDMTT. I think the scopes of the two regimes are just too different. One is financial statement income of over $1 billion US. The other is consolidated revenue of just 750 million euros. So that's a real difference. I also don't see the Republican Congress touching the CAMT for what I would say political purposes. It's I'd be very surprised if they did, because they then likely own the provision, which they're probably not in love with at the moment. Last thing I'll just say is I've heard from other jurisdictions that the administration may also be asking for the UTPRs and IIRs to be turned off for US subsidiaries of foreign parented groups. And I don't know if that's accurate or not, but if it is, it seems to me to be quite a challenging ask, as the US is, I can't imagine, about to forego the collection of its CFC taxes because some other country is offended by them or something. And then I guess really my last comment I'll make is that there also has to be seen some chatter about the ordering rules. As you mentioned earlier, Kara, I think you did, that first the QDMTT gets collected, then the IR would get collected, or the CFC taxes by the parent jurisdiction. And then ultimately, if there's not enough collected there, then you have the UTPR. But it seems that this change in ordering, maybe has some legs, in the sense that if it could be elective at the discretion of the jurisdiction that would be enacting the QDMTT or not, to allow it to forego its collection for the CFC jurisdiction, I don't see how that is completely offensive to the system, especially because the same amount of tax is generally going to be collected. Although there might be some wrinkles to iron out there with respect to SBIE in the local jurisdiction, and how that would get avoided or not taken into account if the CFC taxes came first.
Joachim, I'm curious from your perspective, sort of going from the EU perspective, from what Scott just mentioned, what, if any of that, do you think would be palatable to the OECD?
So, I mean, from an EU perspective, I think there's one thing I'd like to address first, because you hear it a lot from EU governments and the Commission, and that is that the best way forward could be or might be just an extension in time and scope of the UTPR safe harbor, because that's the argument. That doesn't require us to change the Pillar 2 directive, which is politically always difficult because all 27 have to agree. It's a cumbersome process. A lot of horse training typically going on. So why not extend permanently or for some period of time the UTPR safe harbor? And I think this argument is weak, and the solution would be weak too. The argument is weak because if you have a closer look in the Pillar 2 directive, the relevant article, which is Article 32, mentions that member states are allowed to implement safe harbors that are based on effective tax rates, and the UTPR, as we've just heard, is based on the nominal rate. So in my view, the directive, even at the moment, doesn't really allow for the UTPR safe harbor, and you'd have to change the directive, especially if you modify the UTPR safe harbor anyway. So you might as well, go for a bigger solution. And just extending the UTPA safe harbor, I think, will also not be a good solution for various reasons. First of all, if you extend it the way it is, as has been pointed out, then a lot of countries could, especially investment hubs, just raise, if necessary, their nominal rate to 20 or above, and still, narrow their base and effectively undermine the effectiveness of the Pillar 2 regime. And also because developing countries might protest in the inclusive framework because they don't have headquarters, they don't benefit from the UTPA safe harbor. So why should their sovereignty still be limited to quite some degree, whereas the US's, for example, would no longer? So I think that's not a good way forward. And then I could imagine, from what I've heard from some governments, I think there's awareness that you need to do more, especially since the US, as has been mentioned, also would like to see guilty coexistence with the IIR. So basically a guilty being accepted as something sort of equivalent to the IIR to shield, from a US perspective, foreign profits from the Pillar 2. And I think that would be the way forward. And that would, of course, require, because the US is not going to move on that, to accept global blending as something that could be equivalent. Now, that could be helped by the fact that, from what I know, the effective rate of guilty is going to go up to 16.4. So that's more than the 15. So you could say if it's a little bit more, we might be more ready to accept also global blending because it's more than 15%. Also, because if a compromise with the US is struck, we might see fresh momentum for more QDMTTs. At the moment, we don't see much because everyone that doesn't yet have one is in a wait-and-see mode. Now, if there is a compromise, if it's clear Pillar 2 will go on for the rest, we might see more QDMTTs, and that would reduce the relevance of either IIR or guilty applying, because the local QDMTT would have precedence anyways. On the other hand, as I think Pat has rightly mentioned, if we accept global blending with the US by accepting that guilty could be an equivalent, then in my view, it would be imperative that other countries get that option too. So that would mean really going to some extent at the core of Pillar 2 and maybe making it optional, whether you go for global blending with maybe a slightly elevated minimum rate or for jurisdictional blending. And to make that choice a bit more balanced, I could also imagine that countries could say, look, when it comes to the decluttering that is now on top of the agenda in the EU at the OECD, we distinguish. So if there is global blending, there is still more possibility, obviously, for some profit shifting. So we keep the more targeted instruments that we have. Whereas if there is jurisdictional blending, we really declutter. We do away with certain targeted regimes because they're not needed that much anymore. So that could be maybe a viable compromise that could make it also more acceptable to have some countries doing global blending. As for US UPE profits, I think that's really a bit more difficult. So if it's not going to be an extension of the current UTPR safe harbor, either we modify the UTPR safe harbor so it does become one basically for the US, because we say the US has certain additional features and these are necessary for the UTPR safe harbor to apply, with all the disadvantages that that has, or we say, look, we kind of accept that the US has the CAMT as it is, and that is sort of equivalent with the QDMTT, and therefore, you know, we assume they have a QDMTT, we don't tax their local profits. If the US, however, is not willing to do anything about personal scope of the CAMT, of course, the threshold is much higher. I see that difficult, you know, from a European or inclusive framework perspective to happen. So here, I'm really a bit at a loss. Maybe we will just effectively see guilty coexistence plus some form of extended UTPR safe harbor, even if it is only a second or third best solution.
Is the fact that the US is somewhat, let's say we're playing hardball in this moment, Pat, are we going to see jurisdictions that actually roll back elements of Pillar 2 rules that they've implemented because they're going to say, well, if the US is going to get special treatment, then we're going to go ahead and try as well? And is that going to, you know, is the US is, I think it was maybe Scott who said actively imposing, is that going to make this much harder?
I don't know what this is, Kara. Your question is an interesting one. Does that make this much harder? Does it make the, you know, if you will, forward momentum? And I put that in quotation marks.
I think that's
I look. Yes. One might argue that that's not a bad thing. In a world where, if I can pick up on some of the things that Joachim talked about, you know, you are trying to loosen the constraints. Again, going back to the conversation we were having earlier about sovereignty, you're trying to loosen the constraints so that countries do have more flexibility in what they might do. Yes, I can easily see that happening. I would be very surprised if some countries don't come forward and say, hang on a minute, we have a system that applies for the United States, we have a system that applies for other countries. There are certain aspects of the US system I like better. I will have to just pause for a second and note for Joachim, I'm sure you know this, there are many aspects of the guilty regime that are far more onerous than Pillar 2. It is not simply a question, and this is a mistake that statement, I don't want to say mistake, the statement that I hear very often from my colleagues in Europe, that the only issues that are relevant to the design of the minimum tax are so-called global blending and the rate. And that just couldn't be further from the truth with respect to the design of guilty, which is a very, in many respects, a much harsher regime than the Pillar 2 regime. But frankly, from the perspective of a lot of US companies, it's the devil they know. They've gotten comfortable with the guilty system. They can apply the guilty system. They know how it operates. And so they're willing to move forward on that basis. Would I expect other countries potentially to ask the kinds of questions that Joachim has already posed? For example, do we expect that countries might say, well, there are certain aspects of the US guilty regime that maybe I like better than the Pillar 2 rules. Maybe there are other aspects of the Pillar 2 rules that I like better. Maybe I should think about being able to, you know, choose my own adventure, if you will. I actually think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a bad thing. Again, this goes back to the point of sovereignty. But we are, Kara, we're skating around something here that I think it's probably worthwhile just saying out loud, which is the United States Congress, through multiple actions they have taken, including letters they have written, including the introduction of Section 899, which we talked about earlier, you opened the broadcast talking about, focuses on the UTPR. They do not focus on the UTPR exclusively as applied to US income. They focus on the UTPR as a problematic taxing mechanism. And it seems to me that a lot of the issues we are talking about here could be readily addressed if we decided we didn't need the UTPR. Now, I have made this statement before in the presence of folks from the OECD and the presence of folks from other countries, and I've heard, well, you know, the UTPR is a, quote, essential element of Pillar 2, quote, essential. It's essential to have the UTPR as part of Pillar 2, which is a statement that I don't really understand. Because, and again, this is a statement I've made in response to some of these comments from others. Over the course of the last 8 years, the United States has added 3 minimum taxes to the Internal Revenue Code. We added our guilty regime, we added the BEAT regime, and we added the CAMT regime. We added all of those provisions to the code. They all collect revenue for the United States. We did not add the UTPR as part of any of those regimes. So can one adopt a minimum tax regime or a framework for a minimum tax regime or establish standards for a minimum tax regime? Or perhaps, to Joachim's point, a framework that offers optionality with respect to a minimum tax regime without the UTPR? Well, the answer to that is of course. What the UTPR does is essentially is constrain everyone to go down to a very, defined path for how their minimum tax system must look like. And that is, of course, exactly what Congress has pointed out as the problem. So I do think as we think about all of the potential solutions, if we don't say out loud the fundamental question of, aren't we really just talking about the UTPR here? And isn't everything that we're addressing here really all about the UTPR? And going back to where I kind of started, as we think about not wasting the crisis, shouldn't we be asking again, is this really the mechanism that we need? I would submit it's not, but others obviously would have a different point of view. So, but it seems to me we should be asking that question out loud instead of simply saying, well, let's fix this over here and this over here, and maybe we'll have to give a little bit to other countries who want to have a regime that looks like guilty. Why don't we ask the larger questions out loud? What do we think about this UTPR regime? Do we really need to have it? If so, why? Or could we think about coming at this somewhat differently?
Scott, you want to go ahead?
I know Mindy probably has something to say too.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to turn to Mindy as well.
Okay, so just a quick response. First, I mean, I think we're somehow losing the forest for the trees here. This process was started, in theory, to create a global system to stop certain types of tax behavior by multinationals, and also to ensure a level playing field for U.S. multinationals vis-a-vis their foreign competitors. And while this is far from a perfect system, it's moved in that direction. The UTPR, though, is in essence the policeman for the system. And as soon as, even before it's come up, we've seen countries that have been really slow to amend because they want to, or enact legislation because they know that in that interim period, they could still get some additional investment in their jurisdiction by being a place, a haven, if you will, for multinationals. So if we get rid of it completely, I don't see how the system would really survive outside the EU, because the EU, unless they can find a way to get unanimity to change. And so for that reason, I think alone there needs to, whether it's the UTPR or something else, I think there needs to be some device put in place if we think it's important for there to be international cooperation to have a level playing field for multinationals, both in the US and abroad.
Mindy, I want to turn to you. And one question I wanted to ask you as well was, is it possible in the US to design a UTPR that would be acceptable and treaty compliant?
Yeah, thanks, Kara. I've actually been going back and looking at the various iterations of BEAT proposals. The pre-BEAT, the House excise tax that was proposed in 2017, along with the Biden administration's various iterations for revising the BEAT or scrapping it and redoing it. And I'm stuck on the prior version of the UTPR, which was an undertax payments rule. And I wonder, and there's lots of discussion we could have. This is not a BEAT session, but there's lots of discussion about how the BEAT is not really fit for purpose. And I wonder if the US could revise the BEAT so that it was an undertax payments rule. And to Pat's point about this is all about the US opposition is largely about the UTPR, which seems a vast overreach in terms of extraterritoriality and question about compatibility with tax treaties, which I'm curious as to Joachim's views on, but which the OECD has always said they're compatible without giving a reason or any explanation as to the basis for that statement. So I think perhaps if we could scrap the BEAT, turn it into an undertax payments rule that would apply to low tax jurisdictions, to payments made to low tax jurisdictions, and We've got plenty of anti-conduit rules, so if there were concerns about the payments to low tax jurisdictions being, or payments being made to high tax jurisdictions being funneled to low tax jurisdictions, we certainly know how to police those kind of payments with our existing anti-conduit regimes. And so if the US could adopt a UTPR that looked like that, it's not clear to me why the OECD moved from an undertax payments rule to an undertax profits rule, but perhaps that's a place where we could both land in a more compatible regime and one that would also make more sense from an implementation standpoint.
Joachim, I'm interested in your take on this as well, and whether we get rid of UTPR, like, is that a palatable solution? And to get your thoughts on what Mindy just said.
Okay, thanks. Well, from a European perspective, I don't really think so. If you look at it, as I said, there's 43 countries that have implemented the international version of the effective minimum tax, so either IAR, UTPR, or both. But if you have a closer look outside the EU, out of those 43, so that means the remaining 21, just 8 of them have the UTPR. All the 22 EU member states have the UTPR, but only 8 of 21 outside the EU have the UTPR. So the UTPR is really something the EU is particularly interested in. And why is that? So because, as has been mentioned by Scott, without the UTPR, it might well be that the Pillar 2 becomes a European project in essence, because there would be not much, or at least a lot less incentive for others to implement an IR or a QDMTT. And that, of course, would put the EU in a position where it doesn't want to be competitive-wise. So I think from a European perspective, that is nothing the EU would be interested in. And I think that's not really on the table. Now, as to the question that Mindy has raised, whether it's compatible with tax treaty law, I guess most would interpret their treaties as the UTPR not being in line with Article 7, at least, of the treaty. So I think in academia, that is mostly recognized that the UTPR would tend to cause treaty issues. Not, of course, within the EU, because their EU secondary law overrides any treaty law, but in between other countries or between EU member states and other countries, that might often become an issue. But, you have to find a court first that finds that. And even if you have a court deciding so, the logic of the UTPR is if some other country still levies it because there is no tax treaty or they interpret their treaty differently, the UTPR is still effectively working. It's just enough that there's one jurisdiction that is willing to collect.
Hey, Kara, so go ahead, Mindy. I'm sorry.
Yeah, listening to this conversation, I'm just struck by how wholly a self-created problem this all is. This is not climate change. This is not something that was an inevitable. This is not an outside problem that we're trying to solve. We collectively have created a problem that we've now been wrestling with, trying to come up with solutions for. And Kara, you had a question in there, but I don't know that we'll have time to get to. When I try to think about what's going on with Pillar 2 and tie it to, Pat referred to the Pillar 2 as being a moment of crisis, there's much larger crises going on in cross-border trade. And so in relation to those crises, the Pillar 2 seems to be much to really retreat in importance. But I don't think they're unrelated, because if I think about the overreach of international tax policy, multilateral tax efforts in connection with Pillar 2, I think some of what's going on in retreat from the very broad free trade of the past several decades. There are parallels there to reactions to the Pillar 2 very broad also multilateral efforts to develop a comprehensive international tax regime. And so we're busy trying to solve a problem that we created ourselves, but I think it behooves us all to take a step back and consider how we got here and try to develop solutions that are also cognizant of wider cross-border trade trends.
So I agree with what Minnie just said. I just wanted to, though, pick up on something that both Joachim and Scott said, which I think is sort of fascinating because it takes us back full circle to the top of the hour where Mindy was referencing why Pillar 2 became this thing at the OECD. And, you know, certainly she's not the first person to have said it, but I've heard her say it multiple times, that really Pillar 2 is at the OECD because Europe couldn't do it solely within Europe because of constraints under European law to move forward with direct tax measures in the absence of unanimity. And so let's co-opt the whole world into this process. And in effect, what Scott and Joachim both said was, if we don't have the UTPR, this becomes a European-only project. Well, maybe that's okay. Maybe that's okay. The US has our 3 versions of minimum taxes. Europe will move forward with some version of a minimum tax, and other countries will decide what they want to do about that. And to the extent countries decide that they want to continue to offer tax incentives as a means to attract investment, I think that's kind of the point of tax incentives. That's why countries have them. If they didn't affect investment, you would just be wasting money. If you were giving tax incentives for investments that companies were already making, you're just wasting money. So the whole point of tax incentives is, frankly, to distort behavior, to change behavior. And again, Kara, one of the questions that you had teed up for us potentially, which we may not get to, is this question about, well, if Pillar 2 moves forward in its current form, what becomes of the world of incentives? Well, of course, countries are going to continue to offer incentives for the precise reason of affecting company behavior. They want to distort behavior. They want to make companies do something that they would not otherwise do. And this is perfectly acceptable, or was, until Pillar 2 came along. And indeed, even after Pillar 2, it appears it's still perfectly acceptable, except with respect to certain types of tax incentives. I'm not sure I can understand why that makes any sense at all. And so it seems to me, again, going back to this point, we talked about it as sovereignty. We can talk about it using other terms as well. But how does this notion of we want to have some sort of a minimum tax framework that countries can adopt and incorporate into their national laws, but we want that to coexist with countries' ability and willingness to offer tax incentives or other forms of incentive to induce investment? If those two things can't coexist together in some form, I'm going to tell you where my money is. It's that Pillar 2 over time will be the thing that collapses, not the ability of or the willingness of countries to offer incentives in some form or another. One of those two things is going to have to provide more slack than it has up to now, it seems to me. And my money would be on Pillar 2 is the one that has to do it, because countries are not going to stop offering incentives.
Kara, just let me quick kind of retort there. So first off, I think it's important to understand that this was an effort to stop a race to the bottom on corporate tax rates and to level the playing field for multinationals around the globe, whether they're in the US or elsewhere. Before this, before Pillar 2 came on the scene, US, as of the TCJA passage, was the only country in the world subject to the only country in the world that subjected its multinationals to worldwide taxation. And this regime has brought that to a closer reality that other jurisdictions, parent headquartered companies, are also subject to minimum taxes. The other thing I think it's worth pointing out is that this multilateral approach to solving the world's problems, I always think is a good thing. And the more countries decide to go their own way and ignore multilateral institutions and instead take their ball and go home, the less stable the world is, the less stable the economies will be.
So, Scott, let me just take issue with something you said there. You said before Pillar 2, essentially there was nothing. And I'm paraphrasing you, so I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. Before Pillar 2, there was a very active engagement by the US and other countries at the OECD in BEPS. And one of the things that I think is most unfortunate about where we sit today with Pillar 2 is that the BEPS measures were never given an opportunity to actually operate so that countries could see how BEPS operated to potentially protect their tax bases over time. And we could make a determination as countries what was working, what needed to be tweaked. Maybe it would have been wholly insufficient. I actually am skeptical of that because I think that the ability to achieve essentially very, very low single-digit tax rates was already on its way out, well on its way out, before Pillar 2 came along, in large part because of BEPS. But essentially, the momentum behind Pillar 2, in my view, caused all of that BEPS stuff to take a backseat. So we remember back in the bad old days, we had this concept of an OECD compliant patent box. Whatever happened to that? So these concepts are still out there and could be applied. It's not that there's no rules of the road, there's no multilateralism or anything like that. The question is this the right way to come at it? And I think those are, so this, I think it's a straw man to say it's Pillar 2 or nothing. I don't think that was true before, and I don't think it's true now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there could be some compromise. We might very briefly intervene. I mean, we have to acknowledge that Pillar 2, from the perspective of its supporters, had two objectives. It's a broad anti-BEPS instrument, and you might argue maybe it was not necessary for that purpose. I would tend to disagree, but I just want to mention the point. It's a broad anti-BEPS instrument, and it was also conceived, as Scott mentioned, to have a floor for tax competition also, and that was new, for not harmful but fair tax competition about investment. And I think we might come to the conclusion that the second objective, whether desirable or not, is not achievable in the current environment. We have already the substance-based income exclusion that watered it down. We have the marketable transferable tax credits, the qualified refundable tax credits, and other types of tax credits, the qualified flow-through tax benefits that get special treatment. And then if the US on top of that gets special treatment in a way through, for example, a tweaked UTPR safe harbor, so that it can keep its sovereignty with respect to the credits that it gives, then the question really arises, should we maybe be more generous to everybody again? And that's Pat's point again, you know. If we find that it's not achievable, what was the original idea, then we shouldn't just give, to put it bluntly, the US a special deal, but maybe then it's time to reckon that, you know, at least incentives on the expenditure side that are not so prone to BEPS as those on the income side might be something we need to accept, also to avoid those rather artificial distinctions that have their root in financial reporting between qualified refundable and non-qualified tax credits. So it's nothing, you know, I would originally have supported, but the way, you know, things are now, that might be just a pragmatic approach to avoid that we have a whole lot of inconsistencies in the system.
It's a fascinating conversation. And it feels like we've been having this conversation for so long, and yet we're going to continue having it because we haven't landed on a place where we're set. Mindy, I did want to come back to a point that you made, because I do think it's important. And talking about that, we've been hearing so much about tariffs and trade of late. What is the role of Pillar 2 in where we're now in a high tariff world?
Yeah, I have no idea.
You know, the answers, Mindy.
No, so nobody knows from one day to the next what tariffs will be there and which will stick, and what the costs of cross-border trade from any given country will be. But I think what we do know is that there's a lot more uncertainty for any cross-border transaction. And I think what all the back and forth and orders and tariffs one day and tariffs put on hold the next indicates is a reorientation of the US view, and you can question whether or not how long that might last, but I don't think it came out of nowhere. a reorientation against the benefits of, or against a wholehearted agreement as to the benefits of to the United States of U.S. Companies' investment overseas. And given that an underlying presumption of all U.S. international tax rules is that there is a strong benefit from encouraging U.S. investment that overseas, I think to go to Scott's point about how the Pillar 2 buttresses U.S. international tax rules by encouraging other countries to opt into a similar regime, I think that tariffs or the environment created by the threat of tariffs prompts us to question so many of the underlying premises of our entire regime, Pillar 2 of which is part of that.
It's a brave new world these days. Joachim, I want to finish with a question to you, and I welcome thoughts from everyone as well. Where do we go from here? What's going to be the future role of the inclusive framework? You were at the Cape Town meeting, I believe last week, and lots was discussed, future topics were discussed, but really, where do we go from here? Oh, you're muted.
So I think, first of all, the inclusive framework will remain responsible for the administration of Pillar 2, and there is not really anyone advocating to move this anywhere else. However, I think the governance structure there in this regard needs to change. So in my view, it doesn't make much sense that, as I said, 43, or if you include the QDMTT countries, around 50 countries have implemented the regime, but all 140 in the inclusive framework get to decide about how to interpret the detailed rules. That doesn't make sense, and that also from a sovereignty perspective is nothing that is really acceptable. When it comes to just administrative guidance that is limited to interpretation, for example, it should be a smaller circle of those participating that issue this guidance. Why should the others be involved? Whereas when it comes to changing structure, amending the system so that maybe it becomes more attractive or more acceptable to others, that's where the full inclusive framework must still be involved. So I think we need a leaner, more efficient government structure that decides what is for those that participate and what is really for the full forum. And then in Cape Town, it was indeed discussed that, there should be more ambition for the inclusive framework. And here I'd really distinguish, when it comes to promoting better tax policies, when it comes to ideas about domestic resource mobilization, or when it comes to things like coordinating whatever policies, so to address inequality that may arise in tax systems. I think that's fine in terms of a broad brainstorming where Global South, Global North come together. That will work. Whereas when it comes to hard standard setting, I think we shouldn't, create another attempt to have 140 agree on that, because there, I think the national interests are just too diverse. It slows the process down enormously. It waters down any kind of standard. So here, I think, is more an area where the inclusive framework should be more restrained, where the OECD should really be more catering to its core membership, and then, leave the effort to have standards that are working for the whole world to the UN, and let's see what the UN can do about that. And experience might tell us that they might not be more successful than the OECD has been in that regard, but let's see.
Excellent. Mindy, did you have a point you wanted to make? I
was just going to respond to Joachim's point that just a few countries should be involved in the interpretive aspect, because it's just administrative guidance and not changing the structural aspects. And I think we all know as tax experts that there's a lot that happens in the interpretive space, and one could do a whole lot call it interpretation. And so assigning that role to just a few countries, I think, also raises the question of full participation by those countries who are not in that small group.
Well, undoubtedly, it is going to be a continuing challenge. I just want to thank you guys. I really appreciate you coming on today and having this discussion, engaging this discussion, bringing your views, bringing disparate views. This is really how we hope that that we can unearth and actually move the ball forward to the extent that it can be. So thank you
Hey,
all.
Kara,
Enjoy.
I know we're about to leave. Can I offer just one point?
Of course.
A violent agreement with Scott and also Joachim, but violent agreement with Scott, which is I think it's vitally important for the United States to stay involved in this process, and I hope that continues. I was also gratified, as was Scott, to see that that happened last week. I think it's just vitally important for the United States to, quote, stay at the table. I don't really think it was a risk that they wouldn't, but I do think it's really important.
I think that's a great point to make and a great point to sign off on, and we'll keep the conversation going here as well. So thank you, and thank you to our audience. I hope that everyone enjoyed this as much as I did and learned a lot. Have a great day, and we hope to see you on the next one.